So, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this single surgeon series from Sancheti Hospital. And today we have with us Dr. Siddharth Iyer. He is undergraduate, postgraduate from KM Hospital, Mumbai, and he has done his FNB spine from Ganga Hospital. Currently, he is working as a spine consultant at Sancheti Institute for Orthopedic and Rehab, Pune. We also have with us Dr. Anil Solanki, who is a spine surgeon working at Shalby Hospital, Ahmedabad. And we have Dr. Rohan Gala with us, who is a spine surgeon working at DY Patil, Navi Mumbai. So welcome the speaker and the panelist. And over to you, Siddharth, for sharing your screen and presentation.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Anil. Good evening, Rohan, and all viewers. Thank you, first of all, Dr. Ashok Sham, for this opportunity to speak at today's webinar. I'd like to thank Sancheti Hospital for this opportunity as well. Is my screen clear, Anil?
Yes, it is visible.
So today's topic for the discussion is management of osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture. With specific tips, tricks, and techniques as the punchline, and with a smaller punchline of practical approach to common spine problems. So this is the overview of the session. We'll just go through a brief introduction, which would be more general, relating to definition, burden, and pathophysiology. And then we will go into detail in osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures with clinical investigations, non-operative management, what are the indications for surgery, and then completed with the medical management, because in the end, osteoporosis is a medical disease. As far as the tips, tricks, pearls, pitfalls, what I will do is I will keep putting in these tips during the discussion of the slides, and then we can see how they go. So for the introduction, we'll start off with the definition. So it's a disease that has low bone mass, and the microarchitecture undergoes a deterioration, which predisposes this bone to having fragility fractures, and the fracture risk increases. The objective definition by WHO is based on a BMD analysis where the bone mineral density, if it's less than 2 standard deviations below the peak bone mass, then that constitutes a definition of osteoporosis. So there you have it. Something between -1 to -2.5 would be osteopenia, and any score that's below -2.5 is osteoporosis. This is the T-score, so that's basically a comparison between the patient's BMD to a young reference for the standard population. And obviously you have a Z-score, which is the comparison for the patient's BMD to an age match. So a similar age person, that would be for Z-score. So a useful tip here is, if you have any patient who is above 50, then you could look at the T-score as your yardstick to assess. But sometimes you might come across a rare scenario where due to some hormonal issue or some other genetic problem, that the patient is actually a young pediatric patient or someone who's less than 50. And in that sense, a Z-score where you match it to someone who is similar in age rather than a younger population might be also a worthwhile number to compare between the two. So quick burden of disease and the numbers and the consequence that osteoporosis carries with it. So vertebral compression fractures are the commonest fractures relating to osteoporosis. They constitute sometimes 50% of the all osteoporotic fractures. Closely followed by you have hips and distal radius and fractures, which are common. They are estimated to be 9 million such fractures occurring annually, and the disability life years lost is somewhere between 5.8 million. In terms of India, it has been estimated that in 2008, we had approximately 25 million Indians who had osteoporosis in them. What are the clinical consequences? So because you have an osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture, the main problem is you get persistent pain and a resulting disability. It can cause pulmonary dysfunction because as you get kyphotic, the space available for the lung gets reduced. Patients can have height loss. They can end up with deformity. In some cases, even neurological deficit. All these affects the mental makeup of all these geriatric patients. You can get subclinical depression, overt depression, overall reduced quality of life, and ultimately increased mortality. So just like hip fractures have been noted to have a 1-year mortality of nearly 30%, the number is not as high for spine, but still there is a definite increased mortality following osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures. We'll do a few slides, pathophysiology. I think these few points are very important to understand the process of treating the osteoporotic calf fracture. So to start off with, bone remodels throughout life. There's a constant work of osteoblast laying bone and osteoclast resorbing bone. The protein give you the tensile strength, and the mineral or the osteoid or the calcium or the mineralized osteoid gives you the compressive strength. The matter is we have compact and trabecular bone, but the turnover for trabecular bone is nearly 25% as compared to 3% of cortical bone. So when you have loss of bone mass or bone mineral density, it's definitely affecting trabecular bone more, and this clearly stands out because the vertebra, the hip, and the distal and radius are all sites of where predominant cancellous bone is found. So what controls this remodeling? It's mostly by endocrine factors. You have calcium metabolism related hormones. You can have paracrine, autocrine effects. So something like inflammatory rheumatoid arthritis causes a lot of periarticular osteopenia. That is because of paracrine and autocrine effects. At the very basic fact is the osteoclast is very quick to work. It takes 2 weeks to remove bone, but to relay that amount of bone, it might take somewhere close to 3 months. So that's why when you have menopause and the hormonal protective effects stop, so to say, the osteoclastic activity supersedes the osteoblastic activity, and you get a sudden rise in osteoporotic risk fractures once the menopause has occurred. So the integral culprit of this osteoporotic fractures is the osteoclast, and the predominant working module is through the Rankel and Rank system. So the osteoblasts and T cells can produce the Rankel cytokine. If this combines with the Rank receptor on the osteoclast, it activates it from a precursor to an active osteoclast. There are some protective mechanisms such as the OPG, which has a decoy receptor, and one of the prime pharmacological agents used is denosumab, which is again based on inhibition of this factor system. So other important concept is bone mass acquisition. So as you grow from a young to an older person, there is a peak bone mass which is generally achieved at the second or third decade of life. This is what you get at your max. After this, everything is only going to decline. So physical activity, vitamin D and calcium adequate intake, good normal hormonal function, good genes from your parents are some hereditary factors that can affect the peak bone mass, or so to say the savings bank account that you develop for yourself, which you can at max reach is in the second and third decade of life. From there on, whatever you will be doing is probably withdrawing from your savings bank account. So it's very important that you in the growing age have good physical weight bearing exercises so that you achieve a good peak bone mass. In terms of age, this is a simple graph. The solid line is a cortical bone. The trabecular bone is marked by the dotted line. So when you see at the age of 50, when there is a menopause in women, what happens is within the next 10 years, they stand to lose nearly 60 to 50% of their bone mass that they had earlier found. This decline is less precipitous in men because the protective effect of testosterone and gonadal hormones that still go on for many years more. So that's why we have high risk age group, which is post-menopausal women that suffer from osteoporotic compression fractures. So the last slide of the pathophysiology, you have two types of primary and secondary osteoporosis. In primary, you have post-menopausal, that is the one that I just described. Otherwise, age-related decline in bone mineral density is seen irrespective of gender. Secondary osteoporosis are disorders that can lead to precipitous decline in bone mineral density. So this can be hyperparathyroidism, Cushing syndrome, some drug-induced disorders, neurological disorders. In terms of osteoporosis, you have some modifiable factors that also affect it, such as sedentary, non-exercise based lifestyle, smoking, alcohol consumption, reduced calcium and vitamin D intake. There are some non-modifiable which include women, age, ethnicity. Whites and Asians are more common. Thin, frail built, like the photo that you can see on the screen. These are your high-risk individuals for developing osteoporosis and fractures. So from now on, we've completed the general discussion. Anil and Rohan will now move to a more specific discussion for osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures. So let's start with what are the clinical symptoms and signs. If you want to say in the purest term, there are only three. You can get pain, you can get deformity, and you can get deficit. Generally, what the history the patient will give it is there is a trivial fall that is followed by low back pain. Quite often, the pain is not exactly over the midline because it's more flank pain that is associated due to instability that is formed by this microfracturing. This pain is more perceived when they have a gravity loaded position, especially when they are sitting under gravity dependent or standing. While sitting, they need to assume a tripod sign where they, support their bed, and if they lift their arms up, they get extra pain or instability type pain. Ambulation is restricted due to instability type pain, and sometimes if the patient has multiple osteoporotic fractures over a period of time, you can have a loss of height as a finding also. In the examination, you can get instability, you can get neurological compression with weakness in the lower limbs. Apart from that, you can get deformity, which may be localized in some cases, or a more generalized globular deformity also. The common area of affection is thoracic and thoracolumbar spine. So when we talk about one interesting part of the neurodeficit in osteoporosis is instability associated. So this is a paper that is out of a Japanese group. So they noticed that in osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures, when they performed a long segment posterior stabilization without a decompression of the canal, they still found that neurological deficit improved. So this study and there are many more papers along with it that introduce the concept that there is a neurodeficit that occurs due to the instability rather than actually a physical neural compression. And quite often this is the reason why patients might have mild neurodeficit that is more accentuated when they stand or walk under a gravity dependent position. So investigations and assessment for osteoporosis, osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures. So the plain radiograph still is the crux of the investigation. Some common features that you get is an alligator mouth appearance, which is basically a cleft or a radiolucent shadow that you can see in the thoracic spine here marked out by the circle. And on the lateral, it can be seen as a cleft. So cleft, Kumel's disease, non-union pseudoarthrosis, at some levels, they're quite synonymous and have been used interchangeably. You can get a localized kyphosis if the fracture is restricted to a solitary segment, but then sometimes if you have a multiple osteoporotic compression fractures, they can sometimes end up giving you a globular rounded kyphotic deformity as well. You can consider dynamic x-rays. So you get a sitting or a supine film. So sitting is a gravity loaded position in which the cleft collapses. And then you get a supine or a hyperextension film, and sometimes, like this arrow is showing, you get an opening of the cleft, which is seen better on hyperextension. So moving on to MRI, some practical tips. So the use of the MRI is predominantly for identifying neural compression, cord signal changes. Fluid, if there is in the cleft, is seen well in the T2 weighted MRI images suggesting a pseudoarthrosis. One practical tip I found is this MRI is quite useful to identify old versus new, as which fractures are old. Quite often osteoporotic patients have multiple fractures because the disease itself is progressive in the sense if it is not treated. So key in that, or a tip would be to look at the T1 hypointense signal changes and also look at the stir sequences to see any bright signal suggesting an acute to subacute injury. If the T1 has a fat marrow replacement and the stir do not show any bright signal changes, it probably indicates that whatever fracture you are seeing on the MRI is old. So for example, here I have an 85-year-old male who suffered a trivial fall and then had instability type back pain on examination. He was unable to sit without support and has been non-ambulatory for the last 3 weeks. And if you look at the X-ray, quite an osteoporotic spine. There are two where collapses I can see. I can see one at L4, which is quite a concentric collapse and appears quite more severe than the one at T12. And then if you look at the MRI, though the L4 has collapsed, there is considerable fat marrow replacement already taken place, whereas the T12 still looks hypointense on T1, and the T2 shows a nice clear fluid signal change in it. So this was treated with a vertebroplasty. So CT scans, though it's not mandated and all, but I always prefer that I use CT scans. I think it's a good practical tip to consider. It's good to assess the size of the cleft, the location of the cleft, so that you can place your percutaneous needles if a vertebroplasty is present. Also, if you're considering vertebroplasty in a fracture that is not exactly chronic or as is less than say 3 or 4 weeks, it's worthwhile considering looking at the posterior spinal cortex, because if there is a break there, there is a higher risk that the cement might extravasate into the spinal canal. Also, sometimes you want to see on the CT if there is a very clear end plate large defect, which would again mean that once you inflate the cement or inject the cement into the cleft, some of it might percolate into the disc space. Also, whenever I feel that there is a doubt that this is not actually an osteoporotic vertebral fracture, but rather not just an anterior column injury, where we consider wedge compression fractures as predominantly anterior column. But if there is an element of posterior, whether it's a ligamentous injury, PLC injury, that might be an indication for stabilization, it might be worthwhile considering seeing the CT scan as well for any bony injury in the posterior elements, such as spinous process break or any facetal diastasis or facetal subluxations. So though I've put it down as ancillary investigation, I think it's the cornerstone of assessment of bone mineral densities through a DEXA scan. So what is preferred is use a central DEXA, which is either a spine or hip based. So these are done actually on a region of interest. So they mark out the region of interest, which is outlined, and then they get an assessment of the bone mineral density. Sometimes you can get spurious values in the spine, especially if there are large bridging syndesmophytes phytes, or if there is a Paget's or some sort of a sclerotic lesion that is falsely giving you a higher DEXA. There is another option of doing a quantitative QCT, which was also quite sensitive and specific, but the downside is it's more expensive sometimes than the DEXA, and also additionally there is a radiation that is a hazard that is associated with it. Quite often nowadays we find this quantitative ultrasound, which is done as a portable machine, but I would like to give you a tip that it's not sensitive or specific, and this is based out of meta-analysis of 25 studies. So whenever you are going ahead for any treatment for a bone mineral density assessment, it is best that you stick to a DEXA or a QCT for your assessment. Sometimes you do need to take bone biopsies because there might be a possibility of some other disorder such as multiple myeloma in the collapsed vertebra. So it is one of the ancillary tests that you would take. So briefly, what are the indications of BMD? When should I offer bone mineral density to my patient? So this is based out of the 2020 update for the Endocrinology Society of Europe and also the American College of Endocrinology. So any women above the age of 65 or men above the age of 70, any women who are younger than 65 but fit a thin, frail body weight habitus, who had a previous history of fracture either in the hip, wrist, who are on any high risk medication such as glucocorticoids or any other disease that will predispose them to an accelerated bone mass, should be considered for BMD. Whenever you are considering any anabolic pharmacotherapy such as teriparatide, BMD has been suggested to be done at least as baseline, so that you have an idea of how severe the osteoporosis were to start with, and then it will also guide when you repeat it every 1 or 2 years, it will guide your the effect of your pharmacotherapy. So now that you have narrowed down the diagnosis to osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures, having used your X-ray, CT, MRI, and DEXA, there is still a tip here. There can be some pitfalls. There are certain disorders such as multiple myeloma, patients with renal failure with a secondary hyperparathyroidism, or patients might have a primary hyperparathyroidism or even osteomalacia that is compounding their problem. So it is always wise as a tip to consider some basic blood investigation so that you get a fair idea of what is the calcium and metabolic profile of the patient that you're dealing with. So in this sense, a basic renal function test, electrolytes, ESR, calcium and phosphorus metabolic activity with calcium, phosphorus, alkaline phosphatase, vitamin D, and even serum PTH. In this, serum PTH is one optional. I would consider it definitely if there is a plan of teriparatide to be given. Though in some patients, if you're not planning to give teriparatide, you might even sort of avoid it. But assuming you think that this is not primary hyperparathyroidism, if you feel that there is any chance of that, then you would consider it. So now that you've done the ancillary tests and you have also taken the care of all pitfalls, then if you look at osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures, it's a complex problem. And this complex problem starts from the fact that we are having an increasing life expectancy. So as you get a more geriatric population, the percentage of people who will suffer this problem is only going to rise. Quite often, these geriatric population has a number of comorbidities. They might have diabetes, mellitus, they might have renal issues, transplants, previous cancers, etc. They are already on a host of medications in which a lot of pharmacological interactions is possible. Because they are elderly, they already have a lot of degenerative changes that coexist, and the pain generators are difficult to identify. So if you look at the X-ray and MRI here, the patient has two fractures. One appears to be more older than the other one, and then on MRI, it's very difficult whether the pain generator is only one or actually both contributing to it. Similarly, any degenerative process at the lower lumbar spine can also cause a lot of back pain. Also, because of the geriatric population, a lot of them might have movement disorders like previous stroke, Parkinsonism, or neurological disorders. And overall, there is a higher chance of having cognitive decline at this age with Alzheimer's or some sort of dementia, which accentuates the problem of osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture injuries. So there are a couple of classifications for osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture, though uniformly not accepted all over the world, but there are some papers that have postulated. So this one was the first one, or the earlier one, one of the earlier ones. This was in around 2005. It's a Japanese-based Sugita classification. So they went through a morphological classification to assess the vertebral compression fracture, and it was based on 5 patterns. So basically, you look at the anterior wall of the vertebral body. So if there is a bulge, then you would classify it as 2 options: swollen, where the bulge is generalized from pretty much a majority of the anterior wall is bulged, or a projecting type where it's a smaller bump restricted to the upper 1/3. If there is no bulge, then you would look for any dent or a bow of like a ship. So that's the front of the ship, if you can imagine that at the surface of the water. So if you have a dent there in the upper 1/3, it's considered to be a bow-shaped vertebral body. And then there are 2 concave and dented, where the dent is then more in the middle of the body, or concave is where the anterior and posterior vertebral cortex is intact, and predominantly the compression or the collapse is in the central area. So the advantage of this classification was there is some amount of prognostication that was offered. This was based on a series of about 130 odd patients. So if you have a swollen front or a bow-shaped front, they had higher chance of developing vacuum clefts or non-union, so to say. So any patient with a swollen front had the worst outcomes. They had 90% development of cleft. Any patients with the bow format noted to have 50% eventual vertebral collapse with the cleft. Similarly, with projecting type, it was around 40%. And conversely, what they noticed was for the concave or dented type, the percentage of patients that eventually ended up with a cleft were only 10%. So Sugita et al. Suggested that the top 3 images of morphology on the fracture would be a poorer prognostication. So this was old. This is what's new. So this is out of Germany's Society of Orthopedic and Trauma Surgeons. So this was a consensus-based study where they involved a number of surgeons and then came up with a classification, again based on morphology, but in this case they used all. MRI also was required for this study to classify. So in this you had type 1. So basically in type 1, you don't have any bony collapse on X-ray and CT. So looks normal on X-ray and CT. But when you do an MRI, you get stir images which suggest that there is edema or some sort of a hyperintense signal change suggesting bony injury. Type 2 is when there is some body deformation of the vertebral body, but predominantly the posterior wall is intact with whatever deformity is either not there or it is minimal, less than 1/5 or less than 20%. Type 3 was there was deformity in the posterior wall and it was more than 20%. So this is what you would consider to be a burst fracture, where there is a middle column also disrupted and there is some retropulsion. Type 4 were so type 1 and 2 they had given a treatment recommendation in which type 1 and 2 could be treated well conservatively. Type 3 was borderline, and type 4 and 5 were high chance of collapse or to develop deformity or to develop neurodeficit or to develop clefts. So type 4 is complete loss of the vertebral frame. If it completely collapses and it assumes a vertebra plana sort of perception, or a pincer type where you get an anterior fragment and a posterior fragment that is completely unstable, and these tend to end up having deformities, clefts, and and stable spine in formation. Type 5 was when you had some sort of a distraction or rotation element suggesting a 3-column injury. So there was, with the vertebral fracture, some loss of interspinous ligaments or a PLC complex damage. Sometimes over a period of time, as the type 4 would go on to have more and more kyphosis, there would be a functional failure of the posterior ligamentous complex or the posterior tension band, and then it would end up being type 5. So these are the two commonly used classifications. And for the German-based classification, in fact, they have given us a treatment guideline also. So in the sense, they score from 1 to 5 between 2 to 10 points. So any score of less than 6 is non-operative, 6 is equivocal, greater than 6 may be considered for stabilization. There are some modifiers. So if you have a T-score less than 3, then you add a point. If the patient has a pain score of more than 4 on VAS score, then you would add a point. Similarly, if the patient is unable to mobilize in spite of your best analgesic treatment or non-operative treatment, then you would add a point. So under such circumstances, they give you an objective criteria to assess your patients. In the basic sense, the surgical principles that they highlighted were, it's important to gain biomechanical stability rather than, preserve motion. You want to reconstruct the load bearing capacity of the spine. That is the most important, so that the patient can be made to sit and stand soon. Surgery should not be aimed to do a massive deformity correction. You should aim, even if you get pre-fracture sagittal profile, that should be your aim. So not very aggressive in your deformity correction. Whenever possible, try a minimal access surgery. If can be feasible, it's best. If you are forced to use screws and stabilization because there is some sort of a deficit, then use cement augmentation procedures, use the newer screw designs which can offer cement inflation or also hydroxyapatite and things. So we'll discuss that, and preferably long segment. So they define long segment as 2 segments above and 2 segments below in their series. Okay, so management of osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures. We'll just take a quick break and kind of a recap here. Maybe if we can have a short discussion with Anil and Rohan. Anything else that you think that?
I wanted to ask you a few things about the assessment of the osteoporosis, about the DEXA scan.
Yes.
What I found that though it's useful, but it is not 100% sensitive and specific for all cases. And there are some problems with, as you already suggested, that if there is a osteophyte, it may give you a false result. And particularly what we are routinely doing, we are taking the lumbar spine, and majority of the fractures are at the dorsolateral spine.
Right.
So exact value of that fractured segment, we don't know. Right. So any tips regarding that, or any of the bailout option or other investigation you would suggest?
So
the practical,
this was a very valid point that you make. Quite often what happens is if there's an osteoporosis and multiple level fractures, there might be a new one at say L3, but the problem is if L1, L2 are more older, they might be slightly more sclerotic or denser, to say so. And in the guidelines that are mentioned, that they have said that when you draw the region of interest, there is a possibility that they can exclude certain vertebra. Like if you have say a Paget's at L3 or you have some sclerotic lesion at L3, you can exclude. But then they prefer to use hip and spine as the best standard. So I am quite comfortable even if the spine is like a dish. I have a diffuse interstitial skeletal hyperosteosis, and I feel that I might get a falsely spurious result on my spine DEXA. I would be happy to use a hip DEXA in that sense also, in the sense that if she is osteoporotic on the hip DEXA, I think at least medical management is justified. I mean, she will prevent a hip fracture at the very least in her future frax risk assessment or something. So I agree with you that it's not a foolproof science, but amongst the 3 options that we have, if you consider a QCT or if you consider a DEXA or some ultrasound guided, I still prefer DEXA because one is radiation hazard is less, and also, I mean, it's the best out of the lot that we have. So we go with whatever we can. And another thing is, I think in terms of treatment, if a patient comes in with a fracture, I mean, irrespective of his BMD score, I think he still falls into a category that at least the pharmacotherapy should be initiated. So it won't change my treatment option in such a sense. But yes, European Society and American Society have said that if you do plan any anabolic therapy, either teriparatide alone or a sequential teriparatide with denosumab, in that sense, it makes a worthwhile attempt of doing BMD at baseline and then probably repeating every 2 years. Rohan, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so just taking this a step further, I think a lot of patients who are osteoporotic, they also have an added element of degenerative scoliosis happening. So now when there's too much of sclerosis in the lumbar spine, what they have suggested is that you can consider the DEXA scan of the hip, and you can also include the distal end of the radius. Like
Yes.
if you think that you have a tendency that you might have a false reading in the lumbar spine. So at a given point in time, any two areas or regions should be evaluated for DEXA, and then we can take a call on the same line.
Definitely. So I think as a consensus for today's tip for the day, we would I'll summarize in the sense that do an X-ray of your patient who's come to your clinic, and then if you feel that there is an element of a sclerotic element in the spine, and where you feel that the DEXA of the spine might not be might over or underestimate your osteoporosis, then please go ahead and make sure that you get a DEXA of his hip also, and like Rohan has suggested, get a DEXA of the radius. And go with the mean value, whatever you get as a effective T-score. Quite often the reports now give you an effective T-score apart from giving you the individual breakup of spine, hip and distal radius. So that could be a useful tip of the day that all listeners can follow in their clinical practice.
One more question, Dr. Siddharth.
Yes.
Regarding as we are talking of the osteoporosis, and I'm sure after this discussion, everyone will be seeing more of the osteoporosis with interest. But one thing not to forget is in this population also the METs and other pathologies are also very common, and we should not miss them also.
Absolutely.
So in the pre-operative investigation, I would rather rely to have a CRP and serum protein electrophoresis whenever possible, because these are the two things, because infective pathologies are sometimes more commonly seen with the collapse kind of picture on the X-rays, and as you already suggested, multiple myeloma is even more commonly seen with the wedging of the vertebrae. So these two, which are non-invasive investigations, should be included in one's evaluation of the osteoporotic fractures.
Definitely. No, I completely agree. I think Rohan also would agree with this, that if you have any doubt of a more sinister pathology, so you have done your X-ray, you've done your MRI, you've done your CT, and if you still feel this could be something else, it could be a multiple myeloma or it could be a tumor infection, I'm sure that I would also agree that as a pitfall, it is worthy to include an extra test here and there. Maybe I have put up RFT CBC, but yes, definitely a CRP is very well recommended and very well welcome if you feel that there is even a doubt that it might be an infective lesion. And similarly, if say you get a hemoglobin that's bordering at 8 and you get a urine routine that shows some protein, or if you get a ESR that's very elevated, then by all means, I would go with it and say that there is a high index of suspicion. It fits the pattern of a multiple myeloma. Let's get an electrophoresis done. That's a very useful tip coming in from Anil, and I would definitely incorporate that in my practice as well.
I think we should go ahead.
Okay. So going ahead, so management of the osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture. So how I've divided it is under 4 headings. I think the first heading is quite often left in the hustle bustle of doing an OPD practice. I think lifestyle modification and fracs assessment. So we'll do that quickly in 1 or 2 slides. Then we'll go to the non-operative for an uncomplicated vertebral compression fracture. So this terminology is not routinely used, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'm using it. So I'll just go through it uncomplicated, and I've divided into complicated. And then we'll complete the webinar, so to say, with the medical management, because in the end of the day, it's a medical disease. So if a patient with osteoporosis comes to you and has a fracture, I think that itself is a risk for having a fracture 1 year, 2 years, 6 years down the line, or whenever. So unless and until you treat the osteoporosis, you can treat the osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture, however, but to prevent the next vertebral compression fracture, if you don't do the medical management, it's all, whatever good work you're going to do is going to come undone. So though it's going last on that list, is probably one of the most important factors of the management as well. So going ahead, so my personal preference, whenever I do see an osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures, I do ask one of my residents or fellows to just get a quick fracs assessment on how she is looking. Most importantly, I'll speak to the family and say, get floor mats installed in your bathrooms, get an extra railing attached to the commode, because I think 80% of these falls happen on wet, slippery floors at home. I tell all my patients who have had fractures that get a night bulb in your bedroom. Make sure you're sleeping on the bed that's closer to the, the door of the closet. Declutter any furniture that otherwise is always lying in the way between your bed and the toilet in the night. So some small and useful changes in your daily routine, in your daily household furniture, where it's placed. This is more important in patients who have movement disorders, Parkinsonism, who are inherently stable, who are already very geriatric, needing a cane to walk, who might have impaired vision, have maybe cataracts in their eyes, don't hear as well. So all of these go in a long way in fall prevention, and I think fall prevention is a must for all your patients whenever they come to your OPD with a fracture. Before you get to bracing and treating them, fall prevention, just 2 or 3 minutes on that. Obviously, if you have someone who is a smoker or alcohol, modification of this modifiable risk factor is mandated, and also encourage active weight bearing exercises. So some sort of walking, some sort of muscle training and reconditioning, muscle strengthening would go on a long way in improving the overall health of the patient. So the uncomplicated osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture. So in the sense uncomplicated, where the treatment is predominantly non-operative. So if you look at the natural course of osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures, I think 70% will have a partial collapse, but eventually stabilize without any complication. So that's why I say uncomplicated, because eventually they have adequate pain relief. They generally go back to mobilize to their pre-fall status, and they return to those, at least those activities they had. There is a 30% group that either have an extensive collapse that result in retropulse fragments or cord compression or deformity, or end up having some sort of a cleft or pseudoarthrosis with continuing instability type pain. So I just tell all reader or listeners, there are two nice articles from a couple of very good Indian spine surgeons, Dr. Rajshekharan. This was published more recently. That's pretty good. And that's the other one is from Premik and Dr. Abhay Nene's group. So if anyone wants to look up management, I think these two papers cover it quite well. So in terms of management, I advise an initial short period of rest. This can't be too long, because otherwise it becomes counterproductive, because prolonged recumbency affects the lung function. It can pressure sores and other problems creep up. You want to give a good pain analgesia to your patient, to use a multimodal pain management. Just don't stick to only one group of drugs. So you can mix it up with using an opioid with paracetamol. If the renal function allows, maybe a short course of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. If it's possible, there's no harm in taking a short course of it. The ultimate aim is that you need to mobilize the patient, get him out of bed with all this pain management and an early muscle rehabilitation program. So work on the core and extensor muscles, because the stronger the extensor muscles, they will provide an internal splintage to that fracture and prevent it from collapsing too much. Additionally, the deformity, once it progresses, then the extensors get stretched out, and then you have an element of sarcopenia which adds on to it. So good muscle rehab program. Exercise program has been quite noted in a lot of literature that improves the quality of life index, and also additionally, most importantly, reduces the risk of future fractures. Bracing, a word on it. I personally do support bracing because I feel that apart from whatever genuine use it has a placebo effect, at least to my patients. When I tell them that you need a belt for a little while, they're happier with the belt. Though there are some papers that would suggest that bracing really doesn't it does not serve any purpose. But the basic is that is a 3-point support. You have extension braces that like a Ash brace or a Jewett brace or a Taylor's brace, any sort of brace that can be used, especially for if the fracture is below the T8 level. I would put a non-operative management, a fair conservative trial, to be anything between 3 to 6 weeks, and obviously reassess interveningly, maybe once at 2 weeks, once at 4 weeks. But that much would be a fair amount of time to assess the non-operative management. So we'll move on to the complicated one. So 70% will, whatever we did in this previous slide, I think 70% of our patients will settle by this. Then you will get another 30%, though you have tried this, they have not worked out, and then they come with a complicated scenario. So this I And then when you have seen him on follow-up MRI, follow-up X-rays, you have started noticing that he is now developing a cleft or sort of a non-union or a pseudoarthrosis at the collapse segment. This would be a complicated scenario number 2. A third one is maybe now either the patient in the very beginning came to you where you saw a deficit, or he has been treated elsewhere where initially he didn't have deficit but now has deficit with a cleft with possible instability associated afterwards with deficit due to a obvious retropulse fragment, or where there is really a big neural significant deformity but no clear obvious cleft there. So I would just change my treatment based on these modalities. We'll start with the first one. So in this one, when they come to me with a early unable to achieve early mobilization, so basically I've tried my best. I have given them the analgesia, I have given them a brace maybe for some time, but they're not improving. So my first line is I try and counsel them and reassure them to try and see whether they can make that fair assessment of 3 or 6 weeks. Quite often, if they can manage to wait for 3 or 6 weeks, it might even settle. So you don't know. So incapacitated that we might have to consider some sort of an earlier intervention that we would have ideally wanted. So this is not my personal preference, but yes, there is a scope for doing a vertebroplasty or a kyphoplasty as a pain control measure in an acute scenario. So I would put this timeline as anything between say 3 weeks or lesser. The concept is that the cement will stabilize the fracture, number 1. It prevents further collapse, number 2. But all your points of management on the non-operative have to follow once you've done your vertebroplasty or kyphoplasty. But the tip or the pitfall, so to say, here is the caveat here is in early fractures, vertebroplasty has definitely higher risk because the injection pressures are going to be higher. There's no clear fluid cleft there. When you have higher injection pressures because you're using a predominantly a low viscosity cement, there can be extravasation. Extravasation has been noted in vertebroplasty sometimes as rates as high as 40%, though maybe only a smaller segment of those will be symptomatic. Kyphoplasty obviously is safer considering you inflate a balloon and your injection pressures are low, but the downside is the cost. It's considerably much more expensive than a vertebroplasty. So as a final conclusion, my tip is try and see if I can extend this conservative treatment with reassurance, with some sort of counseling, try and see if I can rearrange my analgesia profile. But then if I'm pushed to it, then my options would be vertebroplasty, though the ideal candidate would be someone who has a subacute fracture or someone with a longer duration of history with a cleft, or else I would offer a kyphoplasty assuming the cost is not a concern. So a quick slide on kyphoplasty. So obviously safer in terms of there's not much risk of cement extravasation or pulmonary cement extravasation. The kyphosis correction is an added bonus. You inject pressures slow under low pressures because you already inflated the balloon and created a large space there for the cement to fill in and provide you with that stability that you need. You can use high viscosity cement. So because it's not runny as a low viscosity cement, the chance of it spreading here and there unwantedly is less. There was a paper in kyphoplasty reduction, though we say that, there's some correction of kyphosis. I mean, people should not take it as blanketly. I mean, this works well for maybe 1 or 2 levels. You can't take a multi-level osteoporotic spine and then do kyphoplasty at 5 levels, 6 levels and hoping that it will restore your sagittal balance. I think it is not meant for that. It is meant to be used as a correction for maybe 1 or 2 levels. That would be my suggestion, and nothing more extravagant than that. The downside of kyphoplasty, the cost. It's nearly 10 times more than a vertebroplasty. So that's a big concern. Speaking about vertebroplasty, I think this was an important paper that I thought I would like to show to everyone. So it lost a lot of credibility following this NEJM publication, which had a randomized control trial of vertebroplasty for painful osteoporotic fractures with a sham procedure as its comparison group. And they noted that the vertebroplasty as compared to sham had no results or no change at 1 week, 1 or 3 or 6 months. So once this paper came out, suddenly there was a big talk of the town was vertebroplasty is a sham procedure. I mean, there's no use of vertebroplasty. But subsequently, I feel that somewhere the confidence has been restored. There have been a number of publications after the NEJM publication who are of considerable repute in terms of level of evidence. So you have 2012 European Spine Journal, which is a systematic review of randomized and non-randomized control trial. There's a meta-analysis that has been published in the Spine Journal, and a host of other papers which do suggest that percutaneous cement augmentation procedures in the form of vertebroplasty or kyphoplasty do have a role in the treatment of osteoporotic compression fractures and do afford a reduction in pain score and improve the quality of life of such patients. So a quick comparison of vertebroplasty versus kyphoplasty versus non-operative treatment. So I've used a couple of the level 1 evidences here. So as a basic summary, vertebroplasty appears to be superior to non-operative treatment in terms of pain reduction and subsequent fractures. If you compare kyphoplasty and vertebroplasty, kyphoplasty appeared to be superior for quality of life. Obviously, kyphosis correction is better with balloon kyphoplasty and as compared to vertebroplasty. Cement extravasation is less with kyphoplasty because you're, like I said, low pressure cement insufflation. And they all work predominantly well in the subacute period. So anything that is less than 7 weeks is a good option to go ahead with. So in terms of countering the NEJM study, this was an interesting paper that I came across with. It's from Bronek in the European Spine Journal in 2010. He's basically done a critical appraisal of the NEJM study. So in the sense, he said that the breakdown of levels was not identified in the paper. That was one drawback. Additionally, the average volume that they used per level was about 2.8 to 1.2 plus minus. And the basic science studies, he said, was you need at least a 13 to 16% of vertebral fill volume, which is about half of a thoracic vertebra, assuming it's about 30 ml in volume. And this is effective volume that you need to fill in to actually provide that stability. And if you do not meet this standard, then there's quite a chance that you have falsely got a result that, you know, the vertebroplasty does not adequately serve its purpose. So in conclusion, he said the available data in the publication strongly indicates that the treatment arm includes patients who are not treated in a reasonably effective manner, and the technical information provided in the publication is insufficient to make such conclusive or disprove a clinical efficacy of vertebroplasty. So this was one of the papers that countered the NEJM paper. Your thoughts, just quick word from Anil and Rohan. Do you feel that vertebroplasty is a sham procedure? Or do you feel it does have a definite role in the management of osteoporotic vertebral compression fractures?
Anil, you want to answer this, or I mean?
Yeah, one important thing which I realized that in the initial period when vertebroplasty came in, and then there were a large number of people doing vertebroplasty as a routine procedure, and then suddenly, as you described, it came down. But I think people were missing about the indications. More of the procedures which were done in the acute period were not justified, and if you select a proper patient who had done a conservative trial and not improved on the conservative, and when you find a definite cleft, those are the selected patient which has a definite improvement with the vertebroplasty. For kyphoplasty versus vertebroplasty, at least for the Indian scenario, I feel that vertebroplasty has a good improvement rate, and the cost doesn't justify for the improvement which you get. There are a very good number of publications regarding vertebroplasty comparing the kyphoplasty regarding height restoration and other procedures. I think vertebroplasty stands out well in that.
Okay. So basically, in summary, I think bekar mein badnaam kar diya with wrong indications and karke then you said ye kuch kaam ka nahi hai types. So that's the consensus that definitely does have a role. But yes, you have to be careful in your selection. If you select the right patient, you will get desired results at the end of a vertebroplasty. Rohan, anything other than that? Should I move on?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So a quick, okay, where was I? Okay, yeah. So the second group. So now we have a patient who has mobilized and who was walking, but then at 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks, he says that his pain is still persistent. Number one, it's affecting his daily activities. And then on a follow-up X-ray that I have done, I have seen that there's a cleft developing. I have done an extension film and I've noted that it opens also on extension films. Maybe I got a repeat MRI done and I'm seeing a fluid sign. So I think that is what I've described to you now is a nice and ideal indication for a vertebroplasty that has failed a fair conservative trial. Over a period, you have developed a cleft, and that cleft is having a nice fluid vacuum sign. So once you see this, a good tip is assess the location of this cleft. You know, place bilateral needles so that you enter from both pedicles into that cleft. You know, converge onto the cleft. You can sometimes use a small trick is in your OT. If you can make one bolster big and one bolster small, it kind of gives you a false, not a false, but it gives you a sense of a hyperextension where that cleft really opens up. Even normally, as soon as you place a patient prone, most clefts, if they're well formed, they do open up and become nice radiolucent over the C-arm as well. Once you have your pedicle J needles in position, what would be a good option is do a small saline wash where you can ensure that both your needles are in that same cavity, because saline from one side is coming out through the other side. It washes out any debris in that. And next is a useful tip that I have is actually one of my friends always does this, and then that's where I picked it up from, is use an intraoperative dye, just an Omnipic. I just make sure that I put it in and make sure that I see the dye. Quite often you can get a disappearing dye syndrome, which suggests that there is some leak into a vascular channel. You might want to either replace your needle and repeat it. So just dye, make sure it still remains in the cleft, then wash it out with saline, and then you can consider curing your cement and then putting it in. So once you're curing your cement, don't be in a hurry. Wait for your cement to cure. The right time, they say, is when you touch the cement and take your hand away from it, you should get a standing effect from that cement. So it's not too runny. It should not go in places and extravasate unnecessarily. So make sure you wait for it to cure to effectively. Don't be overzealous in your amount of cement that you want to pack in. If it's a small cleft, it might not take in 5, 7, 8 ml. I think anywhere if you get about 4 ml of cement, like you see in Dr. Bronek's paper, that's an adequate filling of the defect. A quick area on the safe deposit area. So look at your cement deposition in the highlighted zones. As soon as you see that it's getting closer towards the posterior cortex, stop any more cement inflation. Remember, once you remove your needle from the cement and you put in a plunger, there's still going to be another little that's going to go through the canal. So if you're feeling that it's already going towards the red zone, don't insert the plunger. Maybe, leave cement in the track is fine, but then, don't overzealously fill it. And one thing I personally like to follow is always send a biopsy. So this is where, Dr. Solanki's earlier suggestion, you never know what you're dealing with. Your histopathology is the gold standard of all diagnosis. It might not always be that you will get a good sample for the bone. Maybe it will be an empty, a negative needle aspiration or a negative needle biopsy, but I at least attempt one. So at least on my mind, I feel that, if there is an option I could have gotten, I definitely send it. So overzealous packing, you can see some images on the screen. This is not what you want. You have canal you have the cement in the canal. All this can cause considerable problems, late deficit, and even radicular symptoms, which are unwanted and will land the patient into much more trouble. So the third option of the complicated osteoporotic compression fracture. So now you have a patient who either has deficit from the very beginning or has developed, apart from the pseudoarthrosis and the collapse and the non-union, a late onset neurodeficit. There is obviously a cleft and an instability. So in this cases, there is plenty of papers now that suggest that the cleft or the instability is the cause of the neural deficit and not so much a retropulse fragment. So you can consider a posterior segment fixation. I would suggest as a tip is go in for a long segment. So you have 2 anchor points above your fracture, 2 anchor points below your fracture. Don't try and be overzealous in your deformity correction. If it's acceptable for her age and requirements, accept it. As an anterior support, as a reconstruction of the anterior column, a good option is a hybrid where you do a vertebroplasty apart from doing a posterior stabilization. A lot of these patients don't need a formal posterolateral fusion because they're all elderly. I mean, even a non-fusion procedure in this sense or just a stabilization is fine, as long as you have not done a very big laminectomy. If you're doing a very big laminectomy, then I would do something to ensure that the posterior fusion is also done. You can consider, if the patient is affordable, the screws can be augmented. You can consider fenestration screws, or otherwise I have tried with retrograde filling of the tract after preparing it and then using a solid screw, but then that's a little bit of a jugadu concept and things can go wrong. So you should be ready with all your instrumentation, all your screws are tracks are prepared, they're tapped and everything is ready, and then cure your cement. Also, one option is using a screw in the fractured segment once you have put the cement. That has also been discussed in quite a number of publications and as said to be superior to just fenestrated screws where you inject cement through the screws. One of the problem with cement augmented fenestrated screws is the cost is very largely different from solid screws. I mean, the cost range can be over in the tune of 10 times larger. So it's quite a issue using it, especially if you're using it for say 8 levels in or 4 levels in such a case. I always prefer to have a long segment fixation, but there are certain indications where you can get a short segment fixation. I would prefer it if it's a lumbar spine, not so much a thoracolumbar spine. Additionally, if there is a considerable deformity, I would then play safe, go long. If it's not so much of a deformity, then you can consider a short segment fixation, but then I would always include an index screw in the fractured site in this along with the vertebroplasty. So a hybrid fixation where you have some anterior column support to reinforce to go with your short segment fixation. A quick paper on what is good, anterior approach, posterior approach or hybrid approach. So this was a paper in European Spine Journal. They basically compared the neurological recovery and the radiological outcomes and also the activities of daily living, comparing a direct anterior decompression and reconstruction. The second group was a posterior short spanning osteotomy or a shortening osteotomy with direct neural decompression. And the third one was an indirect decompression where they did a stabilization and added a vertebroplasty. So in terms of recovery, in this paper, there was no difference in all 3 groups. And in terms of vertebroplasty, yes, that had the minimal blood loss. So stop, think and act. I mean, there is enough literature out there that suggests that direct neural decompression is not always necessary. If you're convinced that it's an instability associated neurodeficit, you can consider without decompression posterior stabilization. Majority of these patients, when treated with a less invasive procedure such as short segment fixation with vertebroplasty, can come out and have equally good results as their other contemporaries. So just a couple of other papers similar to the one that we said, Ataka et al. From Japan and Saito et al. So they have shown that neurodeficits can be treated with less invasive surgery, either vertebroplasty alone or just posterior spinal fusion without decompression or even short segment with vertebroplasty. So this is the last complicated version. You get a neuro deficit that is either present from the beginning or has developed later on. You can't really see a clear cleft there, but there is a significant neurocompression. So there is a big retropulse fragment. So you feel like you need to decompress this canal. Additionally, there may or may not be a significant deformity associated with it. So for this, the tips are, if you don't have a cleft, don't try and do a vertebroplasty or a kyphoplasty. Don't do at least a vertebroplasty. So consider a posterior long segment stabilization. You can add a decompression in such cases where you feel that the neural canal is quite significantly compromised, or there are signal changes in the cord where the retropulse fragment has abutted the cord. Now, prefer a long segment. I would not be very overzealous in correcting a deformity. Whenever it comes to vertebral compression fractures, I think deformity as a reason to operate should be quite low on your list. You would probably have pain, instability, and the others much higher. Deformity correction can be considered. I would go with a DBO or a PSO if you want some things that's something of a shortening posterior column osteotomy, nothing very big like a VCR with a formal anterior reconstruction. Because quite often these patients are old, comorbid, and won't be the best candidates for such extensive surgery. So the tricky situation comes is when you get multiple fractures and then the deformity has to be assigned, and major surgery of adult deformity correction is going to be high risk with implant failure. So I would really count my patients, spend an extra half an hour, 1 hour, really keen doing anything, stabilizing without an attempt viewers today. So case here, this was courtesy Dr. Professor Keith Luke. So Anil also must have seen this. So really bad porotic spine. It's like cord vertebra at all levels. I mean, in such a vertebral, I think you have to know that sublaminar wires still has a role in modern day orthopedics or spine surgery. I mean, these cord vertebra cannot offer even pedicle screw fixation or won't give you best purchase. So you have to look at the other option of a multi-segment or a multi-segment fixation would be something like a rectangle with sublaminar wires or loop rods, which are bent into a rectangle with sublaminar wires. Even there you can get wire cutouts, but then I just thought of putting this because it's quite an interesting case that I saw during my fellowship. So yes, this is from Dr. Abhinini's paper with the one I had suggested earlier. So it does give you a nice treatment algorithm, which I find is quite useful. So all listeners, you can download this paper and have a look at it. So it basically gives you a nice algorithm how to treat your patients with osteoporotic compression fractures. A word on pedicle screw fixation in fractures. So I think you have to look at three things. You have to see if you can augment your cement fixation. You can see if you can improve your screw design. Things like triangulation, longer size screws, longer diameter screws, anything that afford better pull-out strength. Because if you look at it, there is adequate literature that if you have a bone mineral density that's less than 80 milligrams per cubic centimeter, the pull-out strength of your implants is definitely going to be not as good. So in such a case, using those cement augmented screws and fenestrated screws is worthwhile. You also have some screw designs such as hydroxy apatite coated screws, which biointegrate into the vertebral body and which can be used. Obviously, cost is the major concern in this, but if the patient is affording, then you should consider these in your armamentarium if you're considering a fixation. So finally, we come to the most important part of actually treating osteoporotic compression fractures is the medical management, because no matter what you do so far, if you don't do the medical management, the patient will come back to you with another fracture in sooner than later. So the important part about medical management is it keeps evolving. Our medical physicians keep developing new drugs, new regimes, new guidelines. So you have the tip only here is try and keep up. Every 1 or 2 years, get some endocrinology guide update, at least, because they they cover pharmacotherapy for osteoporosis much better than some of our standard textbooks or papers. So what I'm putting up today is from the 2020 update of the Endocrine Society of Europe and the Endocrinology College of America. So yes, medical management. I will cover it under 4 headings. Who should we treat with pharmacotherapy? That's number 1 question. What are the indications or what are the anti-resorptives? When should you consider anabolic therapy? So increased bone mineral density, when should it be taken up? What are a good candidate for a sequential therapy? And then we'll round it up and complete today's webinar with a discussion on good old calcium and vitamin D. So again, risk of osteoporotic fracture is that you have a previous fracture. So treat the osteoporosis. Who needs pharmacotherapy? 3 very simple, straightforward, that's unambiguous. If you have a patient who has an osteoporotic fracture, irrespective of his BMD, he should be treated with pharmacotherapy. So the moment your patient comes with a distal end radius, or he has a hip, or he has an osteoporotic spine fracture, if he has an osteoporotic spine fracture, irrespective of the T-score or the BMD score, consider him on some sort of pharmacotherapy so that you can reduce the risk of the future fracture. That's number 1. Number 2 is if you have a T-score that is less than 2.5, and maybe he's not had a fracture, but for whatever reason, maybe she's frail, maybe she's had premature menopause, or she has some drugs that are like steroids or anticonvulsant that you think is going to be a cause for her T-score to be poor, and you find a T-score that's less than 2.5, then consider them for pharmacotherapy. For T-scores that are between -1 and -2.5, then I would go and fall back on my FRAX assessment. Go through the FRAX assessment, and if that risk of 10-year risk of fracture is greater than 20%, so the American Academy suggests that these also should be considered for pharmacotherapy of some sort. Next, anti-resorptives. So though there are a lot of drugs, I am going to stick my medical treatment on basically 3. We are going to speak about bisphosphonate, which are the cornerstone or the keystone of anti-resorptive therapy. We'll talk about teriparatide, and we'll talk about denosumab, and then vitamin D, calcium, and we'll round it up with calcitonin, which are probably the main ones that we give. There are some others such as estrogen selective receptor modulators, which I do not personally use in my practice, and I am left out of today's discussion. So bisphosphonates, can be used for up to 5 years. They are anti-resorptive, so they will reduce the decline in BMD. However, they cannot get you any lost bone mass. In such cases, I think drug compliance is quite an issue. You have an array of options. You have from tablets you can take once a week to everyday tablets to once in a year injections. In the sense, I think because compliance is an issue, I personally prefer that if you are offering an anti-resorptive therapy, I would preferably go with zoledronic acid, which is in terms of even efficacy, at least for spine, the risk prevention for future fractures is the best amongst all of them. So one infusion of zoledronic acid over 1 year, and then really follow up the patient annually. Always remember, tell your patients when you're giving them zoledronic acid that you want to prehydrate them maybe with a pint of saline before you give the zoledronic acid. Give it slowly over a period of an hour. Pre-medicate them with paracetamol, because flu type reactions are the most common side effect, which can be fever, malaise, where the patient is incapacitated for 3 days. So ensure that you tell them that such a thing can happen. And apart from that, yeah, I mean that's the best, that the bisphosphonate we can try. Obviously, more than 5 years I would not give, because there are chances of atypical subtrochanteric fractures with prolonged bisphosphonate therapy. So at 5 years, I would consider a holiday. And if the patient's still at high risk for fracture, then maybe consider an alternative treatment. So a quick word on teriparatide. So it's the only drug that is anabolic, or so to say improves bone mass. So it's in the sense, if there's some residents tuning into today's lecture, so it's confusing in the sense, if you have sustained high PTH level in a primary hyperparathyroidism, what happens is bone resorption. But a pulsatile administration of PTH, which is a teriparatide, which is a parathormone type drug, it in fact improves bone mineral density, so much so that it is at 18 months fracture prevention risk in spine has been quoted to be up to 65% risk prevention. And although the maximum recommended duration of therapies to be 2 years, not more than that, because there were some reports of animal studies which have suggested carcinogenic potential in the form of an osteosarcoma. We do need longer studies if we are going to consider this drug for longer duration, but right now 2 years is still acceptable. So who are the candidates for teriparatide? Which patient should I consider for anabolic therapy, so to say, whether it's teriparatide alone or teriparatide with denosumab or denosumab alone? So in that sense, I would consider any patient who has a recent fracture, who has been previously on some sort of other osteoporotic therapy. So it might have been that he's on alendronate, and in spite of being on alendronate, he's come with a new onset fracture, or a patient who has multiple fractures, or if the T-score is less than -3 or worse than -3. Any patient who is on long-term steroids or has any drug intake that is going to seriously jeopardize his bone mineral density, I would consider for teriparatide or sequential therapy. Additionally, if on my FRAX risk assessment, if the 10-year risk of fracture is more than 30%, as per the American Society and European Society, it is wise to consider a teriparatide or an anabolic therapy for such patients. So now we come to the second last drug, denosumab. So I think this has been very well studied. I think this FREEDOM trial, I think for all residents who are listening into the lecture, do take time and read up the FREEDOM trial. So it was a randomized control trial. In the first 3 years, what they did was select one, randomize a group to get denosumab, and the other one got placebo. And in that, they saw that at 3 years, the risk of fracture prevention was reduced considerably. And in fact, there was a BMD change that was not very drastic, but in the tune of about 8 to 10%. Because of good positive results, what they did is they extended the trial with a crossover design where the placebo group again then started after 3 years to receive actually denosumab. And then there was a Lancet publication that published the 10-year follow-up for denosumab injections. So that's 60 milligrams subcutaneously once in 6 months. The drawback is if you do end up stopping denosumab for whatever reason, you have to start the patient on an anti-resorptive, because there is a precipitous decline in BMD if you suddenly stop denosumab and not start any other drug in the interim period. So if you do stop denosumab, make sure that you put the patient on a bisphosphonate immediately without fail. This has been another extension. So we had a FREEDOM study which said, denosumab as solo therapy, and then you have the data and data extension study. So this is where the sequential or combination therapy has brought up, and there's enough papers. So this is a Lancet publication in 2013, where you give denosumab and teriparatide, and they studied whether given alone and combined, what were the effects. And then what they found was, when you give teriparatide as a starting drug and you give it for 2 years and then switch to denosumab, that as sequential therapy is the best. This is the final results that, so to say, we found. So on switching from teriparatide to denosumab, the BMD continued to increase. So it's wise to go with teriparatide first, then switch to denosumab. But if they did the other way around, so if you had denosumab first and teriparatide, there was in fact sometimes transient bone loss. So that's the combination, or sequential is what is accepted now, is first teriparatide and then denosumab. The largest BMD increase they saw in the data and data extension studies were in women who had 24 months of combined teriparatide and denosumab, followed by 24 months of denosumab monotherapy. So, I mean, in certain cases, you might consider even giving both together. So you give teriparatide as daily subcutaneous injections and also denosumab once in 6 months. Quite often, again, the cost might be one of the limiting factors, considering you're giving both drugs and they are a little on the expensive side compared to alendronate or something like a bisphosphonate, which would be much cheaper. So that's about combination and sequential therapy. So we come to the final, the good old calcium and vitamin D. So you have plenty of recommendations. So I'm going with the National Osteoporosis Foundation recommendation. So calcium dietary, elemental calcium intake of 1000 to 1200, less than 50 or more than 50. This is when you consider diet plus supplement. So assuming you're eating a good diet of calcium rich products, then that's fine. Daily vitamin requirements initially were sometime during my MBBS used to be actually 400 to 600, but now recent studies have suggested that even up to 1000 international units to 2000 would be a good figure to start off with. So this is considered to be a dietary, calcium is the first line approach, but then supplements may be used if the diet is inadequate. There was some alarm bells when this came out, because what happened was there was a meta-analysis that published large data, actually 12,000 participants, and found that if you have too much of calcium supplements, you stand the risk of increased myocardial infarction by about 30%. And also pooled data from hip fracture risk said that just calcium and vitamin D does not reduce the hip fracture risk. So I mean, this was a counterpoint, but as what I tell viewers today is, I think you can read the literature and make a judgment for yourself. But I personally, as my own preferences, I do give them supplements, at least 1 tablet of elemental calcium with vitamin D, maybe not like 3 times a day or something that's grossly over. So no, yes, maybe. The National Osteoporosis Foundation says that definitely supplementing in osteopalacia is indicated. Up to 1 tablet is fine, I think, but definitely more research is required to understand what is the true potential of relationship between calcium supplements and myocardial infarction risks. So last word on calcitonin. So again, calcitonin was introduced as a nasal spray, and apart from reduction of fracture risk, there were some papers that suggested that there's an analgesic potential. So when I have a very acutely painful vertebral compression fracture, sometimes I do suggest calcitonin intranasal spray, but this is only for a short course of time, maybe for 2 or 3 weeks. The risk is, the problem with this is, there were some papers again here for calcitonin, salmon calcitonin, which suggested that it has a possible association with cancer risk. So then I've reduced my usage of calcitonin in this sense. Although the FDA, US FDA has not withdrawn salmon calcitonin from its formulary, it still allows usage, but there is supposed to be a possible risk which is not really well defined. There have been conflicting reports. Some have said there is a risk, some have found no risk. So I leave the decision to the better judgment of the treating physician whether he would consider this as one of the options. So thank you. I think that completes my talk. I think we are a bit over, but then yes, we'll take any discussion points. Anil, Rohan.
Anil, you want to talk about the thoracolumbar burst fractures, or like the one?
No, you continue. I have a few other points.
Yeah, so I just want to highlight that the risk that people talk about of even doing a vertebroplasty in thoracolumbar burst, especially when the retropulse fragment is causing the deficit. I think vertebroplasty can be done, and now it has evolved to the extent that now people are just on position, whatever comes in that you can just vertebroplasty and just put percutaneous screws and come out, like with indirect decompression and ligamentotaxis. So that is one advancement that I think myself and Anil has been seeing since we were trained. So it's been like nearly 4 to 5 years now. And the other is about the sequential therapy. Like, is this the way now that you're practicing, or do you have an alternative when the patients are not affording? Like, how do you deal with them?
So if I have any BMD that's worse than -3, I do offer my patients as a first up that you try teriparatide, because your scores are really poor, especially if they fit the points on the screen. But I have not. I don't aggressively tell patients to go for sequential, but at least I tell them to try teriparatide. If they're not willing for teriparatide and they have a T-score that's less than 3, then I would say, okay, fine. At least you can consider denosumab. If they don't consider that also, and they find that that's also not worthwhile for them, then I go with bisphosphonates. I mean, I leave the decision to them, but I discuss the pros and cons.
Right.
I have still not told any patient to take both, actually, honestly speaking, because I find it very difficult to convince them of sticking themselves with a needle once a day and then consider once in 6 months, and now you tell them ye dono karo, ab har roj bhi karo aur fir 6 mahine mein bhi ek baar karo. So then I have never found anyone who's willing to do that so far.
Yeah. Okay.
Just in continuation of that, as you already described, that whenever you stop denosumab, there is a chance that it causes bone resorption. So, till in the literature, if my knowledge is right, then we have not found the endpoint when you can stop actually the denosumab. So it somewhat becomes unpredictable if you once start of the denosumab. So practically, I'm not much convinced about the starting the denosumab in any patient, because I do not know the endpoint when it can be stopped. And of course, it's a bit costly. Not that I am readily convinced about the teriparatide because it is a bone forming agent, and then switching them to the bisphosphonates. But particularly about the denosumab, I am a little bit still hesitant. So any take on
actually, when I did read the Freedom trial, I was quite impressed by what they have found. And I mean, a lot of my clinical decision has been based on the results of that trial, which I mean, in terms of design of study, is a level 1 study. It has an additional crossover, which adds to the clinical validity of the results of this study. So in that sense, I mean, if you look at it, if you have, say, a 75-year-old who's come with you with a osteoportable compression fracture, I think a decade is a fair amount of time. I mean, considering life expectancy also, I would if the patient is willing, assuming that even denosumab on the 10-year extension has shown that it improves BMD in lumbar spine to the tune of 25%. So the 3-year extension showed a marginal improvement, which is around 10%, but the 10-year extension showed something in the range of 25%. So ideally, I mean, I think if the patient is willing to take a drug which is going to directly inhibit the rank and rankel, which is your predominant mechanism or modus operandi for the osteoclast, I think you're going to hit you're going to have the maximum clinical efficacy. So in that sense, I do offer it to my patients. But then yes, I mean, I have always offered a cafeteria approach. You offer them the 3 options of the meals of the day and let them choose what suits them best.
Just one last question regarding your take on cement augmentation in your clinical practice. Do you have a benchmark, like say if a patient has so and so BMD, it is only beyond this when I am actually considering cement augmentation, or do you go on table decision? How do you deal with that?
So I don't have a BMD score at which point I say that I need to instrument this. In the literature review that I did for this talk also, I can't recall anywhere anyone saying that itna BMD score rahega to use the cement augmentation. I think most people, what they have said, including the German publication by the orthopedic and trauma group, that is, if you are considering surgery, if it is possible, consider an augmented screw, because the final end thing is that the pull-out strength for this screw is going to be better than your regular screw. But the main concern for me is, I think, the cost, because I think the cost is, it's not even twice, it's like 10 times higher than the regular screw. So I think that becomes a big issue. But then, yes, if there is a patient who would have this, then I would be happy to offer it as an option. But at least the other things I try and do, make sure that your screws are directed medially, you have good convergence, you have good lengths, you have good sizes in terms of diameter.
Larger diameter screws.
Include a vertebroplasty at, say, if there is a cleft, some sort of anti-reconstruction, maybe add a screw at the index fracture level also.
One thing I would like to add in that, if you cannot have the cement augmented screw, at least to have a dual threaded screw, which are not that costly, would be a good option. And with the cement, some people have a fear that if it needs removal, then it's practically impossible.
Yes.
So many people are now more towards using dual threaded screws and tapered things, and more of that practical approach are used in practice nowadays.
Yeah, I would agree with Anil there that in terms of screw design, if you have a dual pitch diameter screw where you have a cortical pitch for the pedicle hold, I mean, I would go with it definitely, because it's something in between going for a full-fledged fenestrated cement augmentation screw. But the only thing is, I have still not, maybe my literature review is little deficient, but I'm sure there must be some publication on some sort of a finite model analysis on pull-out strength that, a dual thread is better than a regular screw. But I have not really read anything on those lines. So I have not moved to a completely, offering a dual pitch to all my patients. But then, yes, I completely agree with, in terms of screw design, in terms of biologically plausible explanation that this will have better pull-out strength, I am sold on the concept. Yes, I agree with that.
I think that's a very good topic and very good presentation by you.
Right.
So thank you very much. You have covered all the things very nicely.
Yeah,
Thank you, Anil. Thank you. It was lovely catching up with you. And thanks a lot, Rohan. Looking forward to seeing you in person. Yes, Dr. Ashok Sham, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I hope you liked the talk.
Yeah, I think it was really comprehensive and covered most of the points, and it balanced the literature as well as the practical points. So that was very, very nice. And thanks for the panel for a great discussion.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
we are coming to the close of this meeting, and I'll just share for the next week. So next week again we have with us Dr. Nilesh Kamat, who will be presenting on 10 steps for successful Bankart's repair. So that will be again at 6 p.m. Next week. So inviting all our viewers to join us. Thank you again, Siddharth, and thanks, panelists. We are going to
Thank you.
stop the
Bye.
streaming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. See you.
Thank you.
Take care.